All right, good morning. Welcome. All right. Yeah, I'm pumped. Are you? You guys, legendary stories of Jesus Christ today. The feeding of the 5,000, the only miracle that's in all four of the Gospels, and then the walking on water. You know, when you think Jesus and you think, I'm going to write a kid's Bible storybook, you think of these two miracles. But what is going on? What are we meant to take out of these miracles? That's what we're going to dig in today. To start moving in that direction, I want to ask you, can you think of a moment in your life when you felt totally satisfied, fulfilled? You know, the just everything. It was like, yes, I am here. This is it. Is there a moment, maybe a recent one, maybe in the last year, where you just felt great? I was thinking of one moment that comes up periodically in my life is at the very beginning of a road trip. And because there's so much lead up to time away, so much lead up to vacation, you're trying to get all your work done, you're trying to get all your work done at your house, your yard, clean up, you got to pack all this stuff, you got to get some food to take with you. And, you know, and there's some great sort of promised land at the other end. For us, it's often like 1,000 miles of driving through, you know, snow and minus 30 to get to another place, Minnesota, that's where my parents live, and almost exactly the same as here. So it's not really like a weather destination, you know, but it's this moment where it's the beginning, and finally we get to that place where we're in the car, Crystal's there, the kids are there, the garage door is closing, we're driving away. A couple minutes, I got a coffee in my hand, I got the Spitz to my left, and it's the sun sometimes is shining, and it's just like, what a moment. But something I found is that it doesn't last. Have you experienced this? You know, I haven't got into, you know, the calling AMA, but more importantly than that, it's not my normal everyday life. Like that moment, the moment of starting a road trip and feeling great about it just can't last forever. And something I've discovered, and maybe you have, is you get onto this, you know, maybe week-long time away that you were really looking forward to, and like by day 3 or 4, I'm like, we could go home now, you know. I actually kind of like my routine too. And then you get home and then you look at your credit card bill and you're like, oh, the residue of this trip is going to actually last for a little while. And like staying in that place of fulfillment and satisfaction, it's like somebody pouring Coke into your hands, you know, and you're drinking it, you're like, this is delicious, but like very soon it's just residue. That's kind of like when you're looking at the photos afterwards, it's like licking the Coke off your hands. It's like, it's kind of great, but it just reminds you of what isn't happening anymore, actually. I wonder sometimes if people were more satisfied before we had photos. But out of 10, what do you think is the average level of satisfaction in your life? I mean, that's a pretty deep and personal question. So today we're going into this whole topic of satisfaction in life. We're continuing on in John. Today's talk, much like a few other things we'll run into in John, is just the first half of kind of a two-part story. So these miracles happen in the next week. We're looking at the longer passage, the longest passage actually that we'll read publicly in the whole Gospel of John next week, where Jesus talks about this miracle, these miracles that have happened. But today, 2 big miracles and 3 big truths about finding deep and full and lasting satisfaction in your life. And don't we want it? 3 big truths. Number 1, let's just name it. We are hungry, physically and spiritually, and our efforts to satisfy ourselves don't work and don't last. So we do have hunger. It's the way we're designed. We're hungry, and we try to feed the hunger, but it doesn't last. And of course, this is obviously true with food. How many of you have found, like me, that most days you eat, and most of the time, by the next day, you're hungry again? Do you find that? It just seems to happen. It's like there's this need that we can't totally satisfy. We can satisfy it for a moment, but then we need again. Or when you zoom way out on your life, you realize our lives are limited time spans. Our physical bodies will, in time, break down. It doesn't matter how much medical care you receive, how many vitamins you take. If we could finally get to the place where every person in Alberta had their own family physician, you'd still die at the end of it. I mean, let's just be real about these things. And if we're going to honestly think about our life, we have to name that there are these things that we just can't take care of. There's no switch you can flip where you will never be hungry for food and you will not have to deal with death. And these physical realities parallel so much the spiritual realities in our lives. That we have these hungers, we have these desires to be satisfied, to feel good on the inside, to feel like we have deep and meaningful relational connection, to do work that has purpose and makes a difference, to get out of bed and feel like I want to get out of bed. That's always a good start to the day. Spiritually, we want satisfaction. And while there are good things in our lives, so often that does not continue. It's not our day-by-day, moment-by-moment experience. And so what do? We do effort. We try stuff. And, in our individualistic, materialistic, capitalistic society, one of the things we try is to get more. We just try to get stuff. And we're hungry, so we're trying to feed our soul. And we're like, well, maybe it's stuff and money and success and sort of this stuff. But we all know stories of people who have tried that and it doesn't work. I was thinking of a guy I know who really pursued success, really pursued wealth, success in business, and he got there. And over time, though, while he was successful in that way, stuff started to break down in his marriage, stuff started to break down in his extended family, and now he lives in a very big house with a number of cars with nobody else. And I love this quote from Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey, if you don't know him, made movies that used to be funny. And so he didn't used to make movies that were funny. He made movies that used to be funny. If you watch them again, you'll be disappointed. But this is what Jim Carrey said. He had a dramatic, successful beginning of his career. He writes this: I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of. For most Hollywood people, that's the end of the quote. But he goes on, so they can see that it's not the answer. He says, I had an amazing privilege that I got all the money I wanted. I had access to everything I could possibly want. What did I discover? It's not actually what I wanted. So we get more. We feed our souls because they're hungry, and we can end up, if we're able to pull it off, bloated. Soul bloat. It's an issue in our society. And so in our society, then the pendulum swings the other way, and we're like, well, we got to let go of stuff. Then we just got to let go. And, there's this renewed and growing interest in Eastern religions, Eastern spirituality, because it's about letting go. Okay, well, if that wasn't the answer, if materialism and individualism and a bigger house and all these cars isn't the answer, then I just got to let go of everything, and I got to get to nirvana, where I finally just accept the fact that this physical world is not what I'm looking for. I just let go of it all. I sat over lunch a couple years ago with a guy who used to go to our church and had walked away, and I was asking him about that, and the whole time he preached to me about minimalism. I was just like getting rid of stuff. I want to buy nice stuff and have less stuff, and listen to all these authors and podcasters about minimalism, but it's like, what do you have at the end of it? It's like you've gotten rid of some of the junk, but you haven't filled yourself up with anything. I mean, minimalism will not help you understand what your purpose in life is. It will not help you understand where you came from or what you're going to or what you should be up to every day. And so while getting more leaves our soul bloated, just letting go without any sort of a refill leaves us empty. I mean, so it's like you're hungry, so you ate too much, and then you felt bad about that. You didn't feel good. So then you thought, well, I know what the answer to hunger is. Don't eat. That's Eastern religion, like summed up in a really crass way. Just stop eating, then you will find what? Nothing. There's nothing there. We end up bloated or empty. Being honest with yourself, how are the efforts going for you? How's the DIY fulfillment, satisfaction going for you? And where do you long? I mean, maybe a better way to frame the question. Where do you long to experience great and deep and lasting fulfillment and joy and satisfaction. We're hungry physically and spiritually, but our efforts to satisfy ourselves don't work and don't last. But there's this clue. There's these clues that we see every day just in our normal lives. In the same way our physical hunger in some ways parallels our spiritual hunger, so there is a parallel between physical and spiritual provision. Think about this. How did you get here today? And I mean, I hope you remember the drive and the things you did this morning, but, where did we come from? How did you get a body and hands and consciousness and an awareness and even some sense of longing that you were created for more? Like, where did that come from? And we look back and go, well, it was a miracle. I had this, I was standing at the back of Connors Hill a week ago, and somebody during communion came up and had a 3-week-old baby and handed the little baby to me. I haven't held a 3-week-old while they were getting communion, and I haven't held a 3-week-old baby. I always hold them like this, because I got big hands. But I was like, oh, what a miracle. I mean, every baby, it's like, wow, new person. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible. And so we have this clue that there's this miracle of life, but there's also miracle in the day-to-day. I mean, every day we get hungry and we fill it up. And how do we fill it up? We fill it up with miracles. What is happening all over the world? People are just sticking these little pieces of something in the ground. And to this day, scientists can explain a lot of things about how seeds work, but really there's a deep mystery that science has still not uncovered in terms of the why and how of seeds. But we stick these little things in the ground, and they grow us grain, and they grow us fruit trees, and we eat, or fish, or chickens, or cows, we eat stuff. It's just like it's a miracle. We're walking around being sustained by miracles. Might there be also miraculous, supernatural, finger of God provision that is available for deeper satisfaction and long-term rescue? Let's go into the story. Number 2, Jesus' miracles reveal his identity and demonstrate his ability, his unique ability, to truly satisfy not just our stomachs, but our souls. And I want to walk into this with you a little bit. Jesus' miracles reveal his identity and demonstrate his ability to truly satisfy. Now, these miracles happen, like much of Jesus' ministry, around the Sea of Galilee. Many of the villages that you hear about in Jesus' ministry are on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, Bethsaida, other ones. His disciples came from many of these places. These are fishing villages. The society, the culture here is poor, agrarian, oppressed by the Romans, over 50% tax. 90% of the crowd that Jesus was speaking to in the region of Galilee was poor. And when I mean poor, I mean like waking up in the morning, not having any food, any access to food, needing to spend the day trying to figure out where you're going to get food, hopefully getting some food, and then going back to bed, not having any food in the cupboard for the next day. These are the people that Jesus was spending time with. And so before this, it's not in the Gospel of John, but when you map the chronology in the other Gospels, before this moment, Jesus sent out his disciples around the region of Galilee 2 by 2 on sort of some individual little short-term mission trips. And now as they come back, the crowd is big. 5,000 men, estimates of 15 to 20,000 people with women and children. And we're talking about a pretty close to full, Rogers Place coming to hear Jesus. This is a large crowd. And we see when Jesus looked up, verse 5, and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Now, Philip was from the very close town of Bethsaida. That was his hometown, so he was just logistically the guy to say, where do we get some food for these people? Now, we read Jesus had a plan, though. We read in verse 6, he asked this only to test him. Only to test him. Because Jesus, just catch this, Jesus was really not just interested in feeding this crowd a meal. You know how much work it is? Some of you have had the privilege of having your children get married and figuring out that. A banquet for 50 or 100 or 150 people. Huge job. But Jesus wasn't just interested in that, as this week and next week's passage will say. Philip says to him, so Jesus had a plan. Philip says, it would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Technically, 8 months of wages is how much he says, for each one to have a bite. Jesus said, another of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. He says, okay, so it would take 8 months of a common laborer's wages to feed all these people. Andrew speaks up and he says this, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves. So 5 small loaves of bread. By the way, barley is the cheap kind of bread. It's the bread that the poor would eat. 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. And these would be like pickled, preserved sardines, basically. Little salty fish. But how far will they go among so many? Well, let's see. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass, 5,000 men. And then we read, Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over. 12 baskets really isn't that much left over for that big of a crowd, but they kept it. Again, I'm sure shared it with people after this. So the boy and Andrew give Jesus the food. Just follow the flow with me. We'll come back to this. Jesus gives thanks. Now just think about this. The common prayer that Jewish people would pray around food, you may have learned this by watching The Chosen recently, is, blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. This was the common meal prayer. Blessed are you, O God, who brings forth bread from the earth. Beautiful prayer. Reminds us of the miracle. And then Jesus, in this sort of little glory Jesus sphere in the middle of his hands, takes these loaves and fish and breaks them right there in enough pieces for 10 or 15 or 20,000 people to eat. He distributes it. Everyone is satisfied, and there are leftovers with no waste. Wow. Then we read, we'll come back to this, verse 14, that they recognize something special here with Jesus. It says they wanted to make him king by force. Jesus escapes to a mountain. He doesn't come back. His disciples need to go across back to Capernaum where they're staying. So finally they just go. The storm comes. It's dark. Sea of Galilee, 650 feet below sea level. 2,000 to 4,000 foot mountains around. There's always like wind and gusts and gales and storms. And they get stuck in the storm. And then they see, this person walking on the water. And Jesus gets in the boat. He says, it's me, don't be afraid. He gets in the boat, and then we read, they were willing to take him in a boat, and immediately, when Jesus steps in, the boat reaches the shore where they were heading. So sort of another little miraculous piece. Amazing stories, legendary stories, children's storybook Bible stories, better yet, action Bible storybook Bibles. What are these stories about? Why are these stories in the Bible? Why did Jesus walk through these things? Are these stories about you and me? Learning the special supernatural powers of breaking bread. We try this at church potlucks all the time when not enough people bring stuff. God, bless the food. Multiply it. Are they about us learning to step out with faith and courage like Peter when he steps onto the water invited by Jesus? What are they about? Or are they telling us something about Jesus? Now, if you were a first century Jewish person, commentators say you would not miss what is happening in these stories because there is a little clue that you would be very aware of. And maybe you caught it as we were reading today, verse 4. It was the time of the Passover. It was the time of the Passover. Significant clue, because we're in this section where Jesus is interacting with the Sabbath, with Passover, with the Feast of Tabernacles, with the Feast of Hanukkah. And all along as we're going through the book of John, people are asking, who is this Jesus? And they're making different decisions about that and responding in different ways. And at Passover, what are we thinking about? We're thinking about the Passover story. We're reliving the Passover story. We're remembering this amazing deliverer, Moses, about whom it was said there would be a prophet like him later on who would really fully lead God's people to victory. So the Passover, I'll try to do this quick if you want to remember the Passover. 400 years of slavery, the Israelites grew from a family to 1 million people. They're in Egypt. What are they doing? Probably building stuff, according to what we know about the Egyptians. Bricks, mud, all this kind of stuff. They cry out to the Lord under their labor because their life is not a good one. It's a slave life. And God, what does he do? He raises up a leader, a deliverer, Moses. He says to Moses, go and lead my people out of Israel. So Moses comes, he starts these conversations with Pharaoh, and then ultimately he gives direction for the Passover. He says to the people, pack your stuff, get ready to go, tuck your cloak into your belt like you're ready to run, and kill a lamb for your family, and eat ready to go. Also, take some of the blood of this lamb and smear it over the doorposts of your house, because there will be this night where the angel of death is coming over the land. And that angel of death will go into every home, and there will be grief, and there will be wailing, because the firstborn in that home will die. But if you have the faith to spread the blood over your doorpost, the angel of death will pass over your home, and your firstborn will be spared. And so this is the Passover. So this happens. The firstborn all across Egypt was killed. Pharaoh finally relents and says, go, get out of here. God causes the Egyptians to look favorably on the Israelites. They actually give them all kinds of gold and treasure as they go. They leave. They're escaped. They're released slaves, but really soon they get to the Red Sea. Just come with me, a couple more steps here. They get to the Red Sea. Pharaoh has second thoughts. He just lost 1 million slaves. He liked his first pyramid. He wanted a second one, so he follows them, and they're stuck. Pharaoh in the sea. What does God do? Through the leader Moses' staff. See, you've seen Charlton Heston do this. The sea parts. The Israelites walk through. The sea comes back down on Pharaoh, and Israel is free, but they're not totally free because they're in the wilderness. And it will actually take them 40 years of wandering towards the promise of the promised land before they actually get into the promised land. And in this wilderness place, what happens? Every single day except Sabbath, the Lord provides that manna appears on the ground. What is manna? That's what manna means. Manna means what is it? That's what the word means. What is it? It's something like coriander seed with honey. It's like really, really early version honey bunches of oats, but it's just like on the desert floor. And they go out every morning and they pick it up and they eat it. And they're provided for 40 years in the desert until God finally brings them into the promised land. Look, if this happened to your people and your country, and that's why you have a nation today, the Passover's when the nation of Israel was originally established, you celebrate it. What a story. This is who we are. This is who we come. And so when they read verse 4, of course it wasn't called verse 4 until more recently, but when they read verse 4, it was at the time of Passover. They're thinking of all of that. And then they're reading these stories and what's happening. At least 3 things, although there's lots more connections. 1, Moses led Israel through the sea after God parted it. Jesus walks on the sea, calms the storm, and leads his disciples across. 2, Moses led Israel through the wilderness with God providing manna each day. Jesus provides bread in the wilderness for thousands of people. 3, Passover was about Israel's rescue and provision by God. Jesus is not playing the role of Moses in these stories, a great new leader, but instead he is clearly playing the role of God. He's calming the storm with power over nature. He's bringing his people through the sea to safety. He's providing bread in the wilderness. And very interestingly, when his disciples don't know who he is in verse 20, he says to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." And it's translated for the plain meaning, but these are the exact same words, "it is I," as the words that God spoke to Moses from the bush when he said, "I am." Who should I say sent me? God says, "Tell them I am has sent you." And in the next passage later on in this chapter will be the first of the 7 "I am" sayings of Jesus Christ. What are these stories about? What are these stories about? You know, the way that we view somebody affects the way we respond to that person. Have you ever had a situation where who you thought somebody was changed, like you learned more about them? I was in this situation where I think about 19, I was a waiter at this little restaurant attached to a hotel, and these 2 grandpa-ish looking gentlemen showed up, and I brought them their water and gave them some coffee like you did in these kinds of restaurants. And I went back to the little prep room, and the waitress who I was working with, she's like, "Do you know who you're serving?" And I said, "No." She's like, "That's the governor of North Dakota." And I remember this I stood up a little straighter. I walked a little smoother. I looked professional. I was like, I had the thing over my arm. I tried to serve him very well. Now, at the end of the day, the whole state of North Dakota is far smaller than the city of Edmonton, and he ordered a club sandwich and his friend paid, and it wasn't that big of a deal, But because I now understood his identity, it changed how I responded to him. Are these stories about us, or are they about Jesus? And the answer is both, but they're really first about Jesus Christ and then about our response. Do you remember what the whole book of John is about? John 20, verse 31. John says, "I'm writing these stories, these signs, these things that happened through a person, 2,000 years ago." Why? So that you may believe he is the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Jesus' miracles, the reason these are in there, it's not that there are not principles for our faith walk. Certainly there are. But they're so that we can understand who he really is, so we can respond as we must to Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So how are we going to respond to Jesus? What are we going to do with Jesus? Third, lastly, simple, uncluttered surrender to Jesus is the only path to long-term satisfaction. Simple, uncluttered surrender of your life and your heart to Jesus Christ is the only path to long-term satisfaction. I just want to say, wherever you are with faith, if you're kind of looking at this talk skeptically and checking out church skeptically, you are welcome. I'm really glad you're here. And if you've been walking at church for a really long time and you're sorting through these themes, I just want to ask, if you have achieved long-term lasting satisfaction in your life, then don't listen to me. But Jesus makes claims, and the gospel writers and followers of Jesus Christ by the billions since then make claims that there is something available in Jesus Christ that is not available anywhere else. And I just want to ask you, have you found it? Have you found it anywhere else? And if you haven't, what about Jesus? How are we going to respond? There's something very important in this passage about how not to respond. So if Jesus is the path to long-term satisfaction, there's an obvious way that's not a good way to respond, which is to totally ignore or write him off or not pay attention to all of the powerful things that have happened over the last 2,000 years that give credibility to the claims of who he is. Rejecting him, obviously, is not a great way to respond, but there's another way not to respond. And this is really quite powerful for religious-y, churchy sort of people like, y'all who came to church on a Sunday morning instead of sleeping in and eating bacon. And it happens in verse 14. Another way not to respond. Listen, just come along with me in this. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Now listen, in Deuteronomy 18, God promised the people of Israel that one day there would be like the ultimate prophet. The ultimate prophet, kind of like Moses, but the real one who would usher God's people into all of it, the eternal kingdom. Deuteronomy 18. And so they see Jesus, and they say to one another, "Sure, look what he just did. He just fed thousands of people with surely this is the one that we've been waiting for, the Messiah. And here's what I want you to hear. They're right. They're absolutely right. They see Jesus for who he is. He is the ultimate prophet, priest, and king. He is the new and better and perfectly able Moses and David. He is the one who all our hopes rest on. They see him for who he is, but then listen, verse 15. Listen what you shouldn't do with that knowledge. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. They got it right who he was, but then they decided, we're going to force this. We're going to make the promises of God come through by force. And there's at least a couple messages here. One is, you can't get Jesus that way. You can't force yourself into the camp of Jesus. You can't grab him, like you would a sword and stick it in your sheath and a hammer and go pound your neck. You can't use Jesus that way. You can't religion your way into God's good books or into Jesus' good books. And you also can't, as one commentator says, you can't make Jesus your poster boy for what you're trying to do. And I'll just mention quickly, I'd love to talk about this for a half hour over coffee anytime, okay? But there's so many places in our life where we see Jesus for who he really is, but then we try to get Jesus' stuff done by forcing it. Whether that's parenting, or how you interact with people in your place of work, or how you think about politics. Is this what we're doing? Are we forcing the kingdom of God to come? Is this what we're doing? You're right that Jesus is king. You are wrong to think that you can make the kingdom of God come through your ingenuity and hard work and force. Jesus leaves. I'm out of here. I'm done with this. They're going to make me king because they're oppressed. It's a miserable situation. Rome is occupying God's people, the nation of Israel. They're taxing them over 50%. And the people are like, see, this is our chance. This guy can make bread out of nothing. Let's make him king. Jesus walks away. So how do we respond? How do we respond? When we recognize that we are those people who are stuck in the wilderness, desperately in need of food, how are we going to respond? And we see, not in the example of the crowds who want to get this thing done by force. Where do we see it? We see it in the simple response of a little boy with 5 loaves, and some fish. Miraculous satisfaction happens when people give Jesus what they have, even though it's not enough. It's that simple. We don't have what we need to constantly be satisfied all the time. Our resources run short, but God's miraculous satisfaction happens when the people give Jesus what they have, even though it's not enough. Remember the flow. The boy and Andrew give Jesus the food. Jesus gives thanks, breaks, distributes, satisfies everyone. Leftovers with no waste. This whole day, this whole miracle is unlocked because a little boy with 5 loaves, a couple fish, comes up and says, I know it's not enough, but you can have it, Jesus. And surrendering to Jesus is really a calculated risk. It's not foolish. It's not pie in the sky. It's looking at the evidence. It's looking at the things that our heart feel. It's looking around at the world. It's thinking about relationships. It's considering the things that are out there. It's a calculated risk with the hope for a great reward. Think about it, though. It's letting go of what can't actually do the job you're trying to get it to do anyway, with the possible hope that God, if you gave him everything you had, could do even more in your life. Foolish surrender is like participating in the Oilers 50-50. It's fine if you look at it as a donation, recognizing half of your donation goes to a worthy cause and half goes to a lucky person, but you are not going to win. How many of you have won the Oilers 50-50? It's just zero. Just did a quick research That's foolish surrender. That's like, here's my money, And I'm sure we've all done things like that because it's like $5 million, that would be great. But wise surrender is letting go of something you can't hang on to with the risky hope that it might actually really pan out for the better. And just an image that came to my mind, I don't know if you saw on the news, many in the floods that are happening in Brazil, cutting holes in their roof, getting on their roof, waiting for the helicopter. Essentially the choice is here, like, this is my life, this is my home, this is my livelihood, but I've got to let that go for the sake of possibly getting rescued for real life. It's not foolish, it's very wise, actually, not to stay in the basement of your house while a flood is coming. That's really wise, actually, even though you're totally giving up your main possession. And I would say to you that you and I will never find true satisfaction unless we risk surrendering to Jesus. And it is a risk. It is a risk to lay everything on the line for Jesus Christ. But surrender is the key that Jesus says unlocks the door to true and full fulfillment. Practical surrender means inviting Jesus to be the Lord and King and boss of your life, for real. Not keeping any sections for yourself. It means beginning a daily, lifelong apprenticeship with Him. God, teach me. Teach me how to live by your Spirit, by your word, by your people. It means daily letting go of the things that don't last or anything that hurts your relationship with God and others. It means daily taking hold of anything that is good and eternal. There is a risk, but when you walk through that door, the promise is you will get so much more back, plus eternal life. And the theme of Passover also helps us reflect on the type of God we're surrendering to. What kind of God is this? Because this is the second of 3 Passovers in John. The first one is when Jesus came into the temple and gave this kind of cryptic, tear down the temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again, identifying himself as the real temple. Here's the Passover where he's, the second one in John, where he's supplying the sustenance and satisfaction people need. But the third one we will find out, the third Passover in John, that Jesus is more than the one who gives us bread in the wilderness. At the beginning of John the Baptist saw Jesus and said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And in the last Passover, we see who Jesus really is. We see what the character of God is really like, that Jesus actually is the Passover Lamb. The one who personally and sacrificially gives himself up to defeat our greatest enemies, the stuckness of sin and the ultimate destiny of death. Jesus beats them by becoming the Passover Lamb. He gives us the opportunity spiritually to spread his blood across the doorposts of our life and gives us grace, offering eternal rescue and provision. He's making bold claims because he is a bold and different sort of king. And next week, he's going to make everybody uncomfortable as he explains these miracles. And if we preach it well, we're going to make everyone uncomfortable in the auditoriums of Central Baptist Church. Because surrender is an uncomfortable thing. Opening our hands, opening our lives genuinely. You can have it all, Jesus. You get it all. If things go bad or poorly or great or amazing while I'm in this wilderness of this life, you can have it all. You can have it all. I'm risking it all for the sake of the potential ultimate long-term reward. This is the invitation. Are you willing to step across that line, to risk, to have faith, believing that God can provide for you what you and I both know, we cannot provide for ourselves. Ultimate and eternal, lasting joy, fulfillment, and satisfaction. I want to land with some practical on-ramps just to say all that stuff again. First, how do we do this practically? First, surrender yourself to Jesus. Begin the journey of apprenticing with him in your daily life. Let him be your boss for life. Second, regularly ask Jesus if there's part of your life you haven't surrendered. Confess these to him. Say them out loud and to a Christian friend. Third, each day, take Jesus in. Do you want to know how he's teaching you? Take him in through Scripture and prayer. Ask specifically him to encourage you, teach you, convict you, give you strength. And fourth, just a suggestion. Next week, again, is the longest passage we'll read in this whole John series. Read it a few times this week. Read John 6. Reflect on the miracles. Reflect on the hard words of Jesus that are coming next week, so we're ready to dig into it. But I really want to land today's talk just with a moment to invite you, if you want to surrender. I can't surrender for you. I only have access to my heart and to my will. But by God's grace, I want to invite you, if you have the faith, if you have the courage, to risk actually surrendering to Jesus in your heart, to actually speaking that word to him. So instead of praying for you like I usually do and probably will continue soon, I want to invite you to pray to Jesus. And we're just going to put a really simple prayer up on the screen and just give you I think 60 or 90 seconds or something like that. If you want to pray it, I just invite you, maybe open your hands, posture of surrender. Whether this is the first day that you've surrendered your life to Jesus, glory to God, or whether this is another time when you need to resurrender, it's a beautiful prayer. And I just want to say, when you do surrender your life to Jesus, when you say, God, it's yours. I want to lay it all down. Would you forgive me? Would you save me? 100% of the time, Jesus says yes. So if God is drawing your heart to salvation, respond to it. Lay it all down. Risk it and see what he will do with it. I'll invite the worship band to come on back up and open your hands if you're willing, and there will be a prayer on the screen.